From No5 Chambers, I'm Richard Kimblin, and this is the Planning Podcast. In this episode, we turn to design, coding, and beauty. It's been such a pleasure to hear from Professor Robert Adam in conversation with Leanne Buckley-Thomson, Planning and Environmental Barrister at No5 Chambers. Leanne will get us focused on what is happening and proposed, while Professor Adam will take us to his world of architecture, and we're very fortunate to have his insight into what's happening at the interface between the planning system and design. He sits on both of the MHCLG expert bodies, which are looking at design codes, in the context of what is now sometimes referred to as the B to the power of 4 Commission, and in the context of the Planning Reform White Paper. It is a terrific topic, which is at the heart of what we all do, whatever our role might be in placemaking. And it reminded me, as in fact so many of the White Paper proposals remind me, just how far you can get by recycling old ideas. Because I was firmly reminded that there is nothing wrong at all with standard house types, the Georgian terrace being a standard house type. So it's brought me a bit of CPD as well, and I hope it brings information and insight to you too. So let's go. It is Friday the 13th. It is now 5 o'clock. It's not even halfway through lockdown. But we can still make things beautiful, can't we? We can make things beautiful, and we can talk about how we make things beautiful. So shall we talk about that, Leanne?
I think we should, Richard, and it all really starts, I say starts, there's a bit before it, but really starts in earnest in August 2020 with MHCLG's Planning for the Future White Paper. Now, we all know that proposed a package of reforms of the planning system in England, and that part and parcel of what was said would be radical reform, and I pause to note we don't all necessarily agree that it will be, is an aim to actively encourage beautiful development. Now, that in itself isn't new. Those proposals stem from the government-appointed Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission's report, which was titled Living with Beauty, Promoting Health, Wellbeing and Sustainable Growth. That was published, of course, in January this year, and itself proposed a new development and planning framework asking for beauty, refusing ugliness and promoting stewardship. Now, the 3 aims within that paper proclaimed that beauty should be an essential condition for the grant of planning permission, that people are repelled by ugliness, and that the time has come to enhance and care for our country, having been exploiting and spoiling it for too long. So, Richard, key phrases in the report for me, I have to say, included that we should be looking at places, not units, high streets, not glass bottles, and local design codes, not faceless architecture that could be anywhere. So the white paper doesn't hold back either, you'll be happy to know. It states that there is not enough focus on design, there's little incentive for high quality new homes and places, insufficient incentive for proposals that are beautiful, and that quality can be negotiated away too readily, with the lived-in experience of the consumer also ignored too readily, given that local plans don't include the visual clarity that can be provided by binding design codes. Now, Richard, you pointed out the 3 pillars, and of course the pillar that's most relevant to our discussion today is pillar 2, planning for beautiful and sustainable places. Those that have scrutinised the white paper will, of course, remember that the proposals in relation to that are set out on pages 46 to 59. I'm just going to point a few of the highlights for me, but of course everyone should make sure that they've read it all. Under creating frameworks for quality is publishing a national model design code accompanied by worked examples, which would then supplement the national design guide. A revised and consolidated manual for streets, and design codes should only be given weight if they can demonstrate input from the local community, which is really key there. If there aren't local guides and codes, then the intention is to make clear in policy that you look at the National Design Guide, National Model Design Code and Manual for Streets to guide your decision making. I should also emphasise as well the Fast Track for Beauty section which makes absolutely clear that where you've got a proposal that complies with pre-established principles of what good design looks like, development there should be expedited. And what the government's suggesting is that changes to the NPPF and legislation would look to achieve that. There's also an interesting proposal in terms of the use of a limited set of form-based development types. So building on the idea of the past of pattern books, with a tailoring of such patterns to local character and preferences through local orders. So there'll be a pilot programme, it's suggested, to test that. And I just think it'd be really interesting to see how that takes shape now the consultation period's over. But most interesting for me is the idea of local design codes and how you might look at demonstrating community support, which is what you need to do. So it's absolutely great that we've got Robert with us and his expertise on the podcast today.
Well, isn't it just great? Because that point which you emphasised throughout that really succinct review of where we're at from the two documents has a strong emphasis on community and getting design codes to relate to community. And Robert, may I ask, is that something which is a prominent feature of what's being worked through now in terms of how one goes about coding?
Yes, I think probably we need to add a little bit of what Leanne said, is that although if you like, it's like the central pillar in the white paper, in fact, this is happening already. This is happening in advance of the white paper. That a national model design code is currently being prepared, and it will go into the planning system in a way, regardless. So it actually is very important, and of course it draws its brief effectively from pretty much the same place that the white paper draws its brief from the Building Beautiful Commission. But the issue of community is a particularly interesting one. I have a little saying on this, that if you want to get rid of sociologists, get them all together in a room and ask them to define community, because they'll never come out again. Britain is a community, Europe believes it's a community, and my wife's book club is also a community. So the key thing with community is the first thing is identifying which community you're dealing with. Add to that, a local authority is also a community. But I think anyone will accept, for example, the place that I live, and this would apply to anywhere really, is that Winchester is a place, which everyone will say is a place. But I can guarantee you that if we ask people in, let's call it one area, which is called St. Cross, to design a code for somewhere in full flood, I don't think the people in full flood would be very happy. So when you're actually asking the community, the first thing you have to be sure is you actually define the community properly.
What would we do? Perish the thought that anybody would seek to build on green fields. But if there were green fields being built upon, where's the community which attaches to the houses which haven't been built?
That's a good, interesting problem, because in urban context, it's moderately easy. You either extend an urban area or you infill an urban area. But of course, the other thing is that, for example, if you have even an extension to that urban area and it's on a green field, very often it will be a new place. And relatively few people will have a direct contact with it. So who do you ask? Well, if it's in the countryside, actually it's not too difficult. The whole of the countryside is in fact divided up into parishes, and these are generally quite well defined as communities. But for a new town or something like this, where, I'm currently working on, we might be talking about 7,000 houses, but you've only got 24 houses on the site now. Then you have to come up with someone to consult. And in that case, effectively, you would end up consulting a wider community, the people who might have a slightly less direct effect than people living in the next street. And in fact, you almost certainly have to have a different methodology for undertaking that consultation.
That I understand, and one has varieties of characters, and we've been doing character assessment for a long time, and that's been an element in the sort of design debates I've been involved in for a very long time. But coding is a level beyond, and I wondered how one should properly understand the limits of that. How far do you think coding is going to go?
Well, it's a good question, as all the politicians say, when they think about what they've got to say. You can code anything you want, frankly. I mean, building regulations are codes. Effectively, it's a constraint on what you can do, and it's a guidance of what you can do correctly. You can code doorknobs if you want to, but if you are going to have a reasonable coding system, and I think this is the direction it's going, you have to define the limits one way or another as to what you can code such that it is reasonable. This is very important because if you are constantly involved in the process of public consultation, it is quite difficult for people to understand what is reasonable to have control over. And people have personal obsessions. I had a public meeting which was completely hijacked by someone who was obsessed with the fact that she was bothered with scooters in her area and was only interested in how scooters could get throughout the scheme. In the end, you have to have a coding framework into which you can work. And that actually makes it very much easier for everybody, because that you preset the things that are reasonable to discuss and the level at which you can code.
Well, that's a wonderful answer, and it helps me understand, because it is new to me, it helps me understand the flexibility which there is as to how far it goes. And I'm sure Leanne will have a view on this as well. But Robert, do you have any information that you can help us with as to, firstly, how you expect this to be rolling out, quite independent of the planning white paper, and also, secondly, as to why it may help in the development management process, the whole process of actually getting permissions in place in a way which is deliverable, so they don't get stuck at reserved matters stage. So can you help? What's going on, and how is it going to help us?
What's going on is a very comprehensive document is currently being prepared. This comprehensive document is sort of designed, without letting any confidences out, is designed primarily to inform local authorities about how to actually form a code. I don't even know precisely what its publication date is, but that's in progress. It's not complete yet, it's not agreed yet, but it's in progress. But to answer your second question, I think this is very important. A lot of people quite like the idea of guidance. And guidance, I will paraphrase guidance as someone saying, well, it might be quite a good idea to do this, but you don't have to do it if you don't want to. That's not a lot of help, because what actually happens is that people that are responsible for interpreting the vagueness of the guidance end up being the people in control. And that is where a lot of planning debate and heat comes out, because it's very often in the hands of individual planning officers to interpret vague information. The advantage of codes, as it should work, is there should be a simple yes or no. I mean, it's rather pejorative to talk about a tick box, but effectively, let's just take an example. Let's just say that something fairly simple. If you're in an area where you have predominantly the buildings or either are or you wish them to be between 2 and 3 stories, if you come up with a development which is 5 stories, then you won't get permission. And you can extend that to other things like the setback from the street or range of materials and so on. Right now, of course, these things do exist, but of course they're up for endless debate because the way that policies are written are deliberately loose-ended and vague. The idea is to introduce a certain level of precision which cuts a lot of that out. Effectively, what you're doing is you're making those decisions in advance, as a contrary to when something comes up in front of you as a controller or administrator, and you then end up negotiating it. If you like, that negotiation happens in advance with a degree of clarity. And that's the principle, and one hopes it will work that way.
Now, Leanne, is that a good thing or is it not a good thing?
Certainly from a practical perspective, in my view, too much vagueness is not helpful. There needs to be an element of certainty for clients and for everybody involved in a process, so that they know what it is that's expected of them and can take the steps required to meet that, but also so that there's a sense of logic. So from my perspective, I think it's a case of having that certain level of precision that Robert's just spoken about, but also with what I'd like to term sensible flexibility, so that in a sensible set of circumstances, it isn't so rigid that there isn't an ability to create movement around it, to create something that is still beautiful and still within the spirit of what's intended.
I agree with that. I think in all of this, there has to be what I would call range. In other words, you can't define things so precisely. If you define a code very precisely, it's not a code anymore, it's a design.
Yes.
A code has to have a range. The second thing, and I think this is in the white paper, is that the idea of 90% or 95%, let's guess what it will be, of applications that came in would be judged precisely on their conformity to the code. That actually cuts out a lot of administration. If you want to then break through that, you then have to go through a much more complex process. In theory, at least, there should be more time for that, because a lot of it is going to go through in a fairly straightforward way. There is a very important aspect to this, which I think is expressed, but it's really, in a way, it is really quite important, is when people bid for sites, they go out onto the market and you say, right, here is a site that's available, and people tender for it. The people that take the biggest risk are the ones that put in the highest price. And of course, vagueness opens up all kinds of opportunities for gaming risk. And this is one of the things that ties up local authorities hugely, because the financial interest in this is really quite considerable. People put considerable sums of money into it. If you define the risk much more tightly, it means that there'll be less gaming on the risk. It also means that relatively smaller operators will find it easier to compete, because the people that have got the capacity to game the risk tend to be the larger firms.
Now that's fascinating. That's the second podcast in a week where the question of how one gets housing away in a way which improves its affordability has come down to issues such as the one you've just described. That's absolutely fascinating to look into. And it really is a balance, isn't it? Because the balance that you have described is one which goes to risk, but it also goes to design flexibility and what you can achieve outside of the scope of codes. And I do wonder if it goes just a little bit further, thinking about the absolutely fantastic design which I know you put together for a scheme adjacent to a railway station somewhere in the south of England. What you achieved there was a really quite tall building in a place which had, in its surrounding area, some buildings which weren't quite so tall. And I do just wonder whether sufficient flexibility will remain for you to achieve the sort of things which you achieved in that particular instance, or whether the closing down of risk and closing down of flexibility is going to stifle architects. Are architects going to stifle themselves with codes?
Yes, it's one that comes up quite a lot, and it's very good you should raise that particular one, because, of course, it was also sitting next to a very tall building. But nobody liked the tall building it was sitting next to. As I say, the issue that you have got the ability to argue the point will and should remain. The point about this is this deals with the bulk of situations where, frankly, most developments are simply not going to do that. The most they're going to do is try and whack up the density or cheapen the product in order to make more money. So there's always be exceptions. But I think what one does is one isolates the area into which the exceptions fall. As a contrary to, let's take an example of I've worked on where I've actually written codes, written the master plans, is that in the end, the developer decides just to ignore them and plow on and do something a lot cheaper. And the local authority kind of say, well, that's okay then. So it's actually cutting out that part of it. But there's another important point here, and this comes from the architectural profession, and a lot of my fellow architects will not like me much for saying this, but there is an idea that somehow architects have rights to do certain radical or unusual things over and above the rights of the people that have to live with them. This is quite a prevailing idea. It's never quite expressed that way. It's usually said, well, architects must be allowed to do their amazing things. Well, certainly there should be innovation and certainly there should be development, but the idea that the design profession has rights over and above the people that live there is rather an extraordinary idea, but very prevalent in the profession, I have to say.
What I hear, in fact, often at inquiry and in respect of schemes that come our way, and I know come Leanne's way, is the opposite, in fact, on some occasions, that one is presented with schemes which are bland, which are off the shelf, convenient from the point of view of construction and consistency of build, but are essentially stock house types. Do you think that what is emerging, and I know that you're working on the comprehensive documents, do you think that what's emerging will help to address that concern?
Only to a degree, I have to say. You have to say, in my view, there's nothing wrong with standard house type. The Georgian three-storey house is a standard house type. And all that it does is it be absolutely sure that the internal plan works and you know how to construct it. This is to do with the place and the setting. There's a degree to which you can go, a degree to which you can't go. What effectively the codes will do, because they're about the place, not the interior of the house, or for that matter, how the house is built. What they are is about what actually makes the place. And if you can define, for example, how the buildings address the street, you know, the quality of the materials are made, the limitation of the materials are made of, and so on, you are likely to get a better result. The point is that, notwithstanding a lot of the rhetoric about beauty and so on, codes do not make a good design. Good designers make good design. What codes do is to constrain the brief of the designer in a particular way that is likely to improve how the buildings will address their setting. It's fair to say that in my early days in producing codes and asking architects, friends of mine who were extremely radical, if they would accept the codes, the most radical of them said, no, I would like to have codes because then I know what my limitations are when I'm designing. And I'm not going to have other people fiddling about with it later on. So there are two sides to this, but I think the idea that codes will produce beauty, I think, is a fantasy. It's not the case. But what they will do is they will improve the situation into which it emerges. Matthew Carmona, who is the leading academic in this, has done a considerable amount of research, has said that one thing that's come out of his research is that where there are codes, the design almost always improves. Because what it does is it forces people to make more effort with the design, and they tend to employ better designers.
Better designers yielding better design. I mean, Leanne, you spend a lot of time at inquiry, and you encounter the concerns that those who attend inquiries in very large measure to oppose residential schemes, the concerns that they have. I wonder whether you think any of what is proposed as to better designers, and as Robert has been explaining, what we're going to get in any event in respect of codes, do you think that will improve confidence in the planning system and make resistance to residential development change, or do you think it'll just be business as usual?
It's difficult to say, really, Richard, in terms of how it really is going to pan out. I mean, it's positive for locals that there's the suggestion here that designs and codes should only be given weight if they demonstrate input from the local community, because that of course means that, at least in principle, it's being suggested that local people will have a say, have an input in relation to what is built within their communities, and can impart their wisdom from their own perspectives on that. But what I suppose troubles me in relation to that is that gives a little bit, therefore, of flexibility in terms of arguments being raised as to whether or not, in truth, the designs and codes that are forthcoming can demonstrate that input, and who comprises that local community, which is what I think Robert was touching on earlier in what he was saying. So to that extent, it may be that unless that's defined in any great detail, we're kind of where we were already.
The key issues in all of it, well, for a start, if it's a community, it means the majority of the community, in reality. And it's how you get to that majority. And a lot of the consultation processes, like charrettes and EBDs and various things they're called, tend to be either people who've got lots of time, who tend to be either older people, or people who are paid to be there, or people with a bee in their bonnet. It's how you get to that community. And one thing I feel very strongly about, and I've expressed many times, is that unless there is a transparent relationship between the community input, and that has to be very carefully structured, and the codes, people will lose faith in them. I mean, right now there's a consultation process, and what happens is people get, and I'm involved in these, you get such a mishmash of information that you can kind of make it into what you want, and you end up putting something down very sort of woolly and vague, and you're kind of back to square one. If you don't have a very direct relationship between a structured form of coding where people actually say, I said X, or with the majority of us said X, and the code came out as X as well. If they don't see that, they won't bother. They'll say, well, this is just another stitch-up. We're not concerned. And it will, in my view, because the cynicism about the system is so embedded, is it will take time for people to understand that they really can have a say and it really will work. It's absolutely fundamental and crucial. There's a tendency in all of these things. People go away and make up complicated things and say, well, you can't do this, you can't do that. Let's take that vague thing and turn it into something else vague. I think this is absolutely fundamental to success.
Well, that is extremely interesting, and I see parallels with neighbourhood planning, about which there was a degree of scepticism with the Localism Act when it emerged in 2011, it being the only act that I know of which has a slogan as a title. What happened after that was that the government was absolutely dogged in support of neighbourhood planning. And it is now in a different place. It has a degree of support and a degree of permanence. It is part of the landscape. I think that we might see that continued theme. If this is going to be a part of the planning system, whatever the planning system is, as Robert says, it has to be transparent and it has to follow through. Otherwise, people will lose faith in it.
The logic, and I don't know if this is going to happen or not, I mean, the logic is that how the coding is described in the white paper and how it effectively emerging now is it would very readily attach itself to neighbourhood plans and village plans.
Yes, because you're going back to community, aren't you, where we started? Absolutely.
I am slightly cynical about some of the consultation processes. There's a thing called professional weight in there where, you get professionals in and they kind of tell people how it's got to be. If you have something that's very clearly structured, you say, well, here are the pieces that are available to you. And these are very straightforward pieces. You can respond to these pieces in a straightforward way. I think that's going to be very important.
Well, Leanne, we've been very fortunate, haven't we, to have that excursion through what the issues are, both in the context of those who are designing and its interaction with the planning system. So for my part, I'm extremely grateful to you, Leanne, for sketching out where we are and for your input in bringing me up to date anyway, because I wasn't up to date until you did that. And to Robert, who's been fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, it's a great pleasure.
Thank you, Robert.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. That was the Planning Podcast from No5 Chambers. If you liked it, let us know. If you have ideas for new topics, likewise, let us know. Next up will be the question of housing land supply and the particular question of whether or not increasing supply affects affordability. That's the premise in the planning white paper. But is it correct? Or is it more nuanced than that? And moreover, is that the only question which we should be asking? Please do tune in next time. Lots going on in that particular podcast with Richard Blythe from the RTPI, Chief Policy Officer there, and also some fascinating research material which really does shine a light on this fundamental premise to the way in which we go about settling on a land supply figure and a housing requirement. Until then, stay safe, thank you for listening, and goodbye.